What's up, champs? Zaniverse here. It's been 10 years since the release of The Evil Within, and back when it was originally announced, it stirred a palpable excitement among survival horror fans. Directed by the legendary Shinji Mikami, known for creating the Resident Evil series, the game promised a revival of true survival horror. Developed by Tango Gameworks and published by Bethesda Softworks, The Evil Within was not just yet another horror game, it was heralded as a rebirth of the genre. The project started development under the codename Project Zwei, German for 2, a title that reflected the duality of both horror and gameplay innovation that Mikami wanted to infuse within the game. His mission was to create a game that called back to the roots of psychological terror, combining both puzzle solving and an intensely atmospheric world. Having moved away from the Resident Evil series after the incredibly well-received 4th installment, Mikami was driven to innovate, using The Evil Within to challenge players not only with its gameplay mechanics, but also its storytelling and thematic depth. The Evil Within's development encountered numerous challenges, especially with adapting the id Tech 5 engine, which was originally designed for first-person shooters, like the original Rage, and Machine Games' first 2 Wolfenstein games. The engine required significant modifications to accommodate for the needs of a third-person horror game, and the team at Tango Gameworks extensively reworked it to support detailed environments, dynamic lighting effects, and the horrifying adversaries central to the game's combat. The engine excelled in creating environments that shifted and changed in real time, disorienting players and enhancing the feeling of being trapped inside of a nightmare. Another key element in maintaining the game's high tension and unpredictability. Every aspect of The Evil Within's distorted realities that players traverse was meticulously designed to contribute to an oppressive atmosphere of dread. The setting itself is a character, a world that exudes malevolence and mystery. It's not just a backdrop, but a psychological landscape that players venture through, mirroring the protagonist's journey through his own disturbed psyche. The game's narrative is complex and fragmented, scattered across the twisted landscapes, requiring players to piece together the story, much like our character must gather clues to understand the horrors he faces. With Mikami at the helm, the game is both a nod to the terrifying, less action-focused roots of survival horror, and a step forward in the genre's evolution. The core of The Evil Within's gameplay is a relentless exercise in resource management, where players must navigate the twisted world through the eyes of Detective Sebastian Castellanos, a man as unprepared for the horrors within as I'd be for a pop quiz in Japanese. The game recaptures the primary components of early survival horror games, prioritizing resource scarcity and strategic planning over gun-blazing action, especially on higher difficulties. Ammunition and health are in perpetual short supply, making every bullet and syringe as precious as a drop of water in the desert. This never-ending scarcity forces you into a cat-and-mouse game with all sorts of monsters, where the choice to fight or flee can be the difference between surviving and getting your skull caved in by an angry farmer. The Evil Within's gameplay is divided into 3 core pillars, with the first one of these being combat. Combat is deliberately clunky. It echoes the awkward encounters of horror classics, where protagonists weren't seasoned soldiers, but everyday people thrust into nightmarish scenarios. Sebastian intentionally handles heavily, mimicking the real-life clumsiness one might feel if faced with a chainsaw-wielding maniac. This adds a layer of both authenticity and frustration. Sebastian will come across many different foes, ranging from normal-ish looking zombie farmers to horrific abominations spawned from hell itself. Stealth plays another crucial role, as players, especially on higher difficulties, are often encouraged to slip past enemies or to take them out quietly via stealth kills in order to conserve ammo for unavoidable encounters. The game's environments support this playstyle through clever design and layouts that offer multiple paths and hiding spots. These areas are not just functional, but are often imbued with an oppressive atmosphere, filled with haunting visuals and sounds capable of making you jump. Puzzle solving is the last pillar of gameplay, with puzzles that range from simple key-fetching quests to complex conundrums that require manipulating the environment. These brain teasers serve as a brief respite from the constant tension of survival, yet they're imbued with the same eerie aesthetic that pervades the rest of the game. Adding to the game's challenge is a straightforward yet in-depth upgrade system, which allows players to enhance Sebastian's abilities using a substance called green gel. Gel can be collected from slain foes, but can also be found inside of jars scattered around the environments. Gel can be spent in 4 different categories. Abilities, in which you can upgrade Sebastian's capacities like health, sprint duration, melee damage, and how much health a syringe restores. Weapons, in which you can upgrade the various attributes of every weapon in Sebastian's arsenal, ranging from damage and fire rate to clip capacity and critical chance. There's stock, in which you can increase the amount of spare ammo Sebastian can carry for each weapon. And lastly, there's agony bolts, in which you can upgrade each specific type of bolt or crossbow you can fire off, usually increasing their damage or range of effect. The Evil Within also employed a dynamic difficulty system, which tweaks the challenge level based on the player's performance. This ensures the game remains challenging, but fair. It sometimes feels like both a blessing and a curse, however, as the game always moves the goalposts just as you may start to feel comfortable. The Evil Within's story is like a fever dream wrapped in a nightmare, dipped in a surrealist painting, and sprinkled with just enough what the fuck is going on. On the surface, it might seem like your typical detective investigates strange happenings kind of setup, but the game spirals out of normality and straight into the psychological horror, where where reality seems about as stable as a late-stage game of Jenga during an earthquake. The Evil Within puts us in the shoes of Detective Sebastian Castellanos, a man whose private life is about as cheery as the dark, bloody corridors he's about to find himself sneaking through. He's been called in to investigate a mass murder at Beacon Mental Hospital, along with colleagues Joseph Oda and Julie Kidman. Once they arrive, they barely have any time to process the grotesque scenes before they're sucked into a world that seems to have been handcrafted by someone that spent a little too much time binge-watching horror movies while consuming dangerous amounts of illicit substances. Sebastian's entrance into this twisted alternate reality isn't exactly subtle. One minute he's walking through the blood-soaked hospital, and the next, he's being chased down a damp hallway by a chainsaw-wielding maniac, scrambling for his life. You know, just a regular Tuesday for any good detective. It soon becomes clear that the hospital is less of a crime scene, and more of a gateway into some kind of nightmare dimension controlled by Ruvik, a once brilliant child prodigy who has gone full mad scientist in the most literal sense. Think Frankenstein, but with way more emotional baggage. Ruvik, the game's central villain, is a figure straight out of a psychoanalyst's worst case study. He's got all the hallmarks of a troubled genius: traumatic childhood, deep obsession with the human mind, a pinch of world domination level range, essentially the trifecta of evil genius qualifications. Through a series of flashbacks and memories, we learn that Ruvik's childhood trauma was the inciting incident for his descent into madness. After witnessing his sister's horrific death and enduring severe abuse, Ruvik develops an obsession with controlling consciousness and self, ultimately leading to his work on the STEM system. Essentially, a giant machine that links multiple human minds together in one shared reality. Because, you know, if horror movies have taught us anything, messing with other people's minds always ends well. The STEM device is like the love child of Inception and Saw, creating a nightmarish collective consciousness where the rules of reality are entirely subject to Ruvik's whims. Of course, being in control of this alternate reality, Ruvik turns it into his personal horror theme park, and poor Sebastian is the unwitting visitor. Everything in the game, from the grotesque creatures to the ever-shifting environments, is a manifestation of Ruvik's psyche. As Sebastian dives deeper into this warped reality, we encounter a host of supporting characters who are also connected to STEM, each with their own messed up backstory. Julie Kidman, who starts off as her typical cop partner, quickly turns out to be more than she seems. She's got her own hidden agenda, working undercover for a shadowy organization called Mobius, which has its own interest in STEM. Joseph Oda, the reliable third wheel, suffers the most from being the other guy in this tale, as his role is mostly to be someone for Sebastian to yell at when things get too weird. The plot unfolds in layers, each chapter pulling Sebastian, and by extension, the player, further into the twisted depths of Ruvik's mind. It's a slow descent into madness, with reality becoming increasingly unreliable. The environments shift and change without warning, taking you from creepy hospitals to dilapidated villages to what can only be described as an industrial meat grinder. There's a deliberate disorientation at play, reflecting the fact that neither Sebastian nor the player has any real control over the situation. You're not just playing a game, you're surviving someone else's nightmare. But amidst the confusion and blood-soaked corridors, there's a deeply personal story hidden beneath the layers of psychological horror. Sebastian's past comes into play, revealing a man burdened by tragedy. His daughter's death in a house fire and his wife's subsequent disappearance weigh heavily on him, making his journey through STEM not just a fight for survival, but a search for redemption. The parallels between his own loss and Ruvik's trauma are clear, creating a disturbing mirror image of the two men, one who was consumed by his pain, and one who is trying to outrun it. By the time the player reaches the climax of the story, it's hard to tell what's real and what's just a product of the twisted STEM world. The final showdown with Ruvik is as much of a battle of wills as it is a physical confrontation, with the fate of everyone linked to STEM hanging in the balance. In a strange way, it's like Ruvik is a really bad escape room designer, and Sebastian is desperately trying to find the key to get out before the walls literally crush him. The ending, much like the rest of the game, leaves more questions than answers. Sure, Sebastian might escape the STEM system, but the lingering mysteries, Mobius' true goals, Kidman's ultimate loyalties, and whether Ruvik's influence still persists, sets the stage for further exploration in the sequel. The Evil Within's story is a mind-bending roller coaster through a fractured reality, where the line between nightmare and consciousness is forever blurred. It's a tale where psychological horror trumps conventional logic, and where survival means more than just making it out alive. It's about holding onto your sanity, which, as it turns out, might be harder to preserve than your health bar. The Evil Within wasn't content with just twisting your brain and fraying your nerves in the main game. It had more up its sleeve. Enter the trio of DLCs. The Assignment, The Consequence, and The Executioner. These DLCs didn't just tack on a few extra hours of gameplay. They took what we thought we knew about the story and gameplay of The Evil Within and flipped it on its head. Each one offered a different perspective, literally and figuratively, while throwing in some new mechanics, characters, and even a wild change in genre by the time we get to the third DLC. First up, The Assignment. This DLC ditches Sebastian, our favorite detective, in favor of his mysterious and oh so suspicious partner, Julie Kidman. From the moment Kidman steps into the spotlight, it's clear we're in for a different ride. Unlike Sebastian, who tackled his problems with a mix of stealth, gunfire, and the occasional panic sprint, Kidman takes a more measured approach, by which I mean she spends a lot more time hiding and running than shooting. The gameplay here leans heavily into stealth, which makes sense considering that Kidman isn't exactly kitted out with heavy weaponry. Instead of hoarding bullets and green gel, you'll be sneaking around corners, hiding in lockers, and using distractions to avoid the grotesque enemies lurking in the shadows. The shift in gameplay is refreshing, but also terrifying in its own right, where Sebastian had the option to stand his ground, even if it meant awkwardly emptying his clip into a monster's frontal lobe. Kidman is far more vulnerable. This vulnerability adds a new layer of tension, because you're constantly aware that one wrong move could end with her being torn apart by the various monstrosities patrolling the environments. It's less about clearing a room, and more about slipping through it unnoticed. Kidman's flashlight plays a key role in solving puzzles and navigating the dark, twisting environments, which was a fun mechanic that I hadn't really seen before. Then there's the story in the assignment, and let's just say it's like being handed a few extra pieces to the jigsaw puzzle that is the evil within. Except half of those pieces are still missing, and the ones you do have are covered in blood. We learn that Kidman is working for the shadowy organization Mobius, which, surprise surprise, has its own sinister agenda involving the STEM system. She's got her own secret mission to retrieve Leslie, the boy who is key to Ruvik's plans, but things quickly go south as they often do in this genre. Kidman's journey sheds light on her true role in the story, filling in some of the gaps left by the main game, but it also raises a whole bunch of new questions. The Consequence picks up right where the assignment leaves off, and this time we see even more of Kidman's story unfold. The gameplay remains largely the same, with the stealth heavy mechanics taking center stage once again, but now we do at least get some more action thrown in to spice things up. Kidman does eventually get her hands on a few weapons, but the game never fully abandons the feeling of vulnerability that defined her earlier experience. You're still encouraged to sneak, but when you do have to fight, it's all about making your shots count, because if you thought Sebastian had a rough with limited ammo, Kidman's supply is practically non-existent. The environments in The Consequence continue the mind-bending, reality-warping trend set by the main game. Only now we see them through the lens of Kidman's perspective. We get deeper insight into her conflicted loyalty to Mobius and her growing unease with the organization's morally questionable motives. The DLC gives us more background on why Kidman is so determined to capture Leslie and what exactly Mobius plans to do with him. Finally, we arrive at the Executioner, and here's where things get really interesting, or downright bizarre, depending on how you look at it. In a wild shift from everything we've seen so far, the Executioner trades stealth, survival, and Sebastian's constant state of anxiety for a first-person combat-heavy experience where you play as the Keeper. Yes, that hulking monstrosity with a safer ahead. Imagine the most terrifying enemy in the main game, then imagine you are that enemy, swinging a giant hammer and smashing enemies to bloody bits in glorious first-person chaos. Also yes, it's as fun as it sounds. Everything played before feels like a curated haunted house experience, while the Executioner is more like a chaotic demolition derby. The tone here is completely different, focusing less on psychological horror and more on visceral action. The Keeper is tasked with eliminating a series of enemies in various arenas of the Victoriano estate, all while upgrading his abilities and weapons to become an even deadlier force of destruction. It's like a twisted game of boss rush, with some light RPG elements sprinkled in for good measure. You can unlock new weapons, increase your strength, and even add some flair to your murderous rampage by acquiring new abilities. It's still the evil within, but it's cranked up to 11 with a heavy metal soundtrack playing in the background. But it's not just mindless violence, however. Well, mostly not. The story of the Executioner gives us a glimpse into the human side of the Keeper. You play as a father who has entered the STEM system to rescue his daughter, who's trapped in this nightmarish world. The contrast between the brutality of the gameplay and the tragic emotional motivation of the protagonist adds a surprising layer of depth to what could have been just a straightforward slaughter fest. It's weirdly touching. The 3 DLCs for The Evil Within offer a fascinating expansion on the base game's themes, mechanics, and story. The Assignment and The Consequence bring a stealthier, more narrative-driven approach to Kidman's side of the tale, while the Executioner gives us the chance to play as one of the game's most iconic villains in a genre-bending, combat-heavy romp. Together, they add new dimensions to the Evil Within universe, answering a few questions while posing plenty more, and making sure that whether you're sneaking, shooting, or smashing, you're always looking over your shoulder, wondering what nightmare is lurking just around the corner. If you're anything like me, and that is to say, stupid, you might be scratching your head a little bit at the Evil Within story. I kid you not when I say that this is the first time in years I genuinely had to read wiki pages to fully grasp a story after finishing a game. And at its core, The Evil Within is a tale of twisted science gone horribly, horribly wrong. The whole nightmare begins with the STEM system, a device created by a mad genius named Ruben Victoriano, aka Ruvik, who really should have just went to therapy instead of becoming a flesh-melting villain. STEM is essentially a machine that links minds together in a shared consciousness, a sort of dream world, only the dream quickly spirals into a Freddy Krueger-style horror fest. Ruvik developed STEM with the goal of controlling consciousness, but his motives are deeply personal. He wanted to bring his sister, Laura, back from the dead after a traumatic accident burned her alive. So, in true horror film fashion, he turned to unethical science and some light brain surgery. Spoiler alert, it doesn't go well. Our protagonist gets pulled into this nightmare when he and his partners, Julie Kidman and Joseph Oda, are called to investigate a mass murder at Beacon Mental Hospital. What they don't know is that the whole thing is a setup orchestrated by Mobius, a secret organization with nefarious goals tied to STEM. When Sebastian arrives at Beacon, he gets sucked into the STEM system, along with a bunch of other unfortunate souls. Here's where things get weird. Once inside of STEM, Sebastian is basically running around inside Ruvik's mind, only Ruvik's mind looks like a Salvador Dali painting mixed with a Halloween slasher movie. The environment shifts, reality distorts, and the horrific creatures you encounter are manifestations of Ruvik's trauma, fears, and experiments gone awry. Throughout the game, Sebastian's goal is to escape this twisted nightmare, but he's also trying to figure out what's happening to him, his team, and why he keeps running into a creepy kid named Leslie. Leslie is the key to the whole thing, as Mobius wants to use him to replace Ruvik as the core of the STEM system, which would allow them to control their shared consciousness and use STEM for their own devious purposes. Ruvik, understandably, isn't too happy about being replaced, so he's trying to take over Leslie's mind and use his body to escape STEM and return to the real world. By the end of the game, Sebastian manages to destroy Ruvik's physical form inside STEM and escape with his life, but not without some serious mental scarring. The big twist though is that Ruvik does escape by taking over Leslie's body. That's right, the evil scientist is now free in the real world, hidden in plain sight as a quiet, mentally unstable boy. Oh, and Mobius is still out there, pulling the strings behind the scenes, so everything's definitely not okay. Now let's talk DLCs. The assignment and the consequence focus on Julie Kidman and reveal her secret mission throughout the events of the main game. Turns out, Kidman has been working for Mobius the entire time. Her mission was to extract Leslie from the STEM system and deliver him to Mobius, who planned to use him as a new core for STEM, thereby allowing them to control the minds of anyone connected to the system. But here's where Kidman's moral compass starts to wobble. She begins to doubt Mobius's true intentions, especially after seeing how many people, including her friends, are getting chewed up and spat out by the system. In her 2 DLCs, we see Kidman grapple with her orders and eventually rebel against Mobius, realizing that using Leslie is just another step in a long line of unethical manipulations. Her DLCs show her side of the story, including her battles with terrifying creatures, like that lovely spotlight-headed monstrosity, and her growing determination to stop Mobius from using Leslie as a pawn. By the end of her journey, Kidman comes to Sebastian's aid, helping him escape STEM, but the larger threat of Mobius still looms. While Kidman chooses not to follow her orders to capture Leslie, she knows that Mobius won't stop until they have what they want. The Executioner, the final DLC, flips the narrative and gameplay entirely by letting you play as the Keeper, one of the most terrifying enemies from the main game. This time, however, your father, who enters STEM in search of his daughter, who's trapped inside. The father is forced to become the Keeper, the hammer-wielding safe-head monstrosity, to navigate the horrors of STEM and defeat all sorts of enemies to find and save his daughter. The DLC plays out like a combat-focused boss rush, but then adds an emotional layer by showing the lengths a parent will go through to protect their child, even if it means becoming a monster. In the end, the Executioner serves as a strange, poignant counterpoint to the main game's themes. While Sebastian, Kidman, and Ruvik are all caught in a power struggle over STEM, the Keeper's story reminds us that, even in a world full of nightmares, there are human connections and personal sacrifices being made. It's a small twisted silver lining to a story filled with madness. When The Evil Within hit the shelves in 2014, it was like the release of a long-awaited horror movie sequel. Everyone was hyped, expecting Shinji Mikami, the godfather of survival horror, to swoop in and save the genre for its perceived decline. And, like any good horror movie, the reactions were mixed. Some people left the theater shaking in their boots, while others were scratching their heads, wondering what they had just witnessed. In short, the critical reception was all over the place, ranging from "this is the revival we needed" to "what's with the camera angles? Is this an art film or a video game?" Critics were generally in agreement on one thing: The Evil Within delivered on its promise of bringing back the tension-filled, resource-starved survival horror experience. For those who had grown tired of more action-heavy titles like Resident Evil 6, Mikami's game was a welcome return to a slower, more deliberate style of horror, where every bullet counts and running out of ammo is a genuine cause for panic. The game's ability to make players feel constantly vulnerable was seen as a triumph of old-school survival horror design, a reminder that sometimes the best way to handle a situation is to run screaming in the opposite direction. But then came the criticisms, and oh boy, they came in as fast as one of Ruvik's malignant monsters. For one, the technical issues couldn't be ignored. At launch, the game suffered from a few problems that felt a little too much like Ruvik messing with the STEM system. Framerate drops were frequent enough to make you wonder if the game was haunted by its own code, and the infamous letterbox aspect ratio, you know, those cinematic black bars that make everything look like you're watching a horror flick on Netflix, felt more like a claustrophobic punishment than a stylistic choice. That's also why they've been absent for most of this video. It wasn't long before gamers started asking, am I being chased by a chainsaw maniac? Or just my graphics card trying to process this mess. And then there was the story. Oh, the story. Some critics and players reveled in the game's psychological complexity, appreciating the fragmented narratives as a deliberate homage to classics like Silent Hill that thrived on ambiguity and mind-bending plot twists. Others, however, felt like they were trapped in a bad acid trip, one where no amount of cutscenes or journal entries could explain what the hell was actually going on. Did I just time travel? Why is the hallway now a village? Am I in some different dimension, or did I just get lost on my way to work? These were the kinds of questions players found themselves grappling with, and not always in a good way. The combat also drew divided opinions. Fans of Mikami's Resident Evil 4 appreciated the tight, nerve-wracking gunplay, where enemies felt genuinely dangerous and every encounter could be your last. However, others criticized the control scheme, feeling that it was intentionally cumbersome, like trying to drive a tank through a narrow alley while being pursued by a rabid dog. And then there was the infamous trial and error design, where some of the game's trickier sections felt like they were designed solely to want you die again and again, until you finally figured out the magic formula for not being turned into zombie chow. Despite the mixed reviews, the game still managed to carve out a solid place for itself in the horror genre. Hardcore fans praised it for staying true to survival horror's roots, emphasizing atmosphere, resource management, and a constant sense of dread. The Evil Within wasn't about giving players the satisfaction of becoming an overpowered superhero, it was about keeping them grounded in fear, reminding them that they were just one bad decision away from being another splatter on Ruvik's floor. The legacy of The Evil Within is an interesting one. In many ways, it served as a litmus test for where survival horror was headed in the mid-2010s. It proved that there was still a market for tense horror games, but it also highlighted that the genre couldn't rely on nostalgia alone. Mikami's return to form was widely appreciated, but it was clear that some modern refinements were needed, like, for example, not making players feel like they were peeing through a keyhole the entire time. And yet, for all its quirks and faults, The Evil Within has earned itself a loyal fanbase. It's become something of a cult classic, embraced by those who love its blend of grotesque imagery, mind-bending narrative, and relentless atmosphere. It's the kind of game you go back to after playing the newer, more polished horror titles, just to remind yourself what true old-school horror feels like. Sorta like comfort food, if you will. The game's influence is still felt today, especially in the resurgence of survival horror games that focus on vulnerability and atmosphere over brute force. In a way, The Evil Within helped pave the way for titles like Resident Evil 7 and Remothered, both games that recaptured the slow burn horror that many players craved after years of bombastic, action-heavy shooters disguised as horror games. Just don't mention Resident Evil Village. In conclusion, The Evil Within left an indelible mark on the genre. It was messy, confusing, occasionally frustrating, but undeniably terrifying. A game that managed to be both a callback to the glory days of survival horror and a testing ground for new ideas. It didn't get everything right, but it reminded us why we love being scared in the first place. And if you could get past the awkward controls and the sense that you might need a PhD to fully grasp the story, you were rewarded with an experience that stuck with you long after you turned off the console. Just like the best horror movies, The Evil Within left you with nightmares, and maybe, just maybe, a little paranoia about what may lurk in the nightly shadows of your hallway. Hey there, happy Halloween! Thanks for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe, as I have 290 more reviews to make between now and the inevitable heat of the universe. Follow me on Twitter and join the Discord. I've been Zeniverse, and I'm off to drive circles in the desert.